everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of Business Therapy. My name's Sam. I'm accompanied by Jonathan, as always. And today we have a guest, Madelyn Dunlap from the ReWild Group. Before we get started today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all of our weekly topics and discussions. Today, we're going to be having a riveting conversation about conscious business. Our guest is also in what we would consider the conscious business space. But before we get started, I'll let her, in her own words, describe her background and what she's about.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam and Jon, for having me here today. So I come to you from the ReWild Group, and we help small and mid-sized business owners really understand what's going on in their business from a unique perspective. We have decades of research and really uncovering that businesses are ecosystems. They aren't machines like people traditionally think. And I'm hoping today to share with you guys just some tangible insights as to what that means and how you can use that information to help grow a more sustainable business.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we were really glad to meet you, Madelyn. Jonathan and I, we talk about conscious business law on the podcast, and one of the things that is really central to what we talk about business is the business as an organism, or the business as a living thing. And you mentioned the business ecosystem. I think generally, it's very close to my heart. I have a science and a biology background myself, and I've always enjoyed looking at living systems. And I think the business is a very complex living system, and this reductionist idea that, like you mentioned, the business as a machine, people are cogs in the wheel of a giant assembly line. I think that's starting to shake loose a little bit in different ways across the market, but it's really nice to meet another group in the field that's talking about the business as an ecosystem versus the business as a machine, because I think the more we can at least even have that foundational mindset shift, it will open up routes of conversation that in a lot of traditional businesses are just not, it's just people are still not there yet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It even comes down to our name, the ReWild Group. It comes from the idea of rewilding in nature. And the most famous or notable story of that was in Yellowstone National Park, where there was an ecosystem that was on the verge of collapse. And they had basically traced that back to having too many elk in the park. And they tried all these things that just looked at that one simple problem. Think of it as the cog. They basically said too many elk, we've got to fix that. We tried to remove elk, they increased hunting. They did all these things that directly targeted that problem. Well, turns out that it didn't work because there was something missing in the organization, in the ecosystem. And because of these interconnected, complex relationships, you can't just say, this is the problem, I'll just swap it out or just cut that off and we'll be fine. The solution ended up being really that they introduced gray wolves into the park, and that had this reverberating impact throughout everything. It changed how the rivers flowed through the park. And so what we see is most businesses really, it's not this, well, this is broken, fix it. This person's not working out, cut them out, and it fixes things. There's really, it's really a more organic relationship that goes on in an organization. And I don't know why we're surprised at that, because organizations are made up of people, and people aren't cogs. It just doesn't work like that. And so that the mindset of really saying this business is like a watch. We use the analogy like a watchmaker versus a beekeeper. As an entrepreneur or a CEO, if you're trying to be a watchmaker, what that means is if something breaks, you have to fix it. That also really reduces all the things in your business to pieces and parts that can be swapped out. But it's not a very scalable business. It's not really a sellable business. Because at the end of the day, you, the watchmaker, are the one who's responsible for the success of it continuing to run. If you, on the other hand, really see it as like being a beekeeper, as really being this hive and trying to create the optimal conditions for your organization to thrive, that's a much more sustainable, and not just in, how we think of sustainable today, but just it's a scalable business. It's one that can grow and thrive without you involved in tinkering in every little piece and part.
Madelyn, can you speak a little bit about how the methodology brings that to life, brings the concept to life? And applies?
Yeah, so I'll try not to get too tangible, and maybe if you'd like to get more tangible, you can kind of push that way. But what we see is that there are these kind of fundamental areas of a business. If we think of the ecosystem in Yellowstone, there are these key contributors to that ecosystem, and we see business similarly. We call them elements, and they're elements in the area of leadership, culture, infrastructure, and strategy. And when we look at a business, it's oftentimes we're saying, well, what are these pieces based on the symptoms we're seeing popping up? What pieces need strengthening? What pieces need more cohesion in the organization? What pieces used to work but maybe aren't supportive of the organization in its current state? And so, more logistically, we're going and we're assessing the business. We're saying, okay, this is where you're at. This is where we would expect you to be based on our decades of research. And here's the gap. And this is why you're feeling this way. This is why your organization isn't thriving. And it really isn't it's not, here's the cog, replace it. It's really, well, the interdepartmental planning in your organization, how you plan and allocate resources across your organization in a way that you're not having this siloed mentality across your leadership. That's not working. So we have to start instilling principles, sharing with the individuals in the organization. Why is this important? Creating knowledge and shared language around these concepts so that you can infuse this information so that the organization itself is really the source of that solution. And so I think it's a very different perspective. A lot of what we do, we spend, not in I don't like to reduce it simply to this, but it's a lot of education. And it's not education in the traditional sense, but it's really this empowering understanding of what's going on. Because most people in business that are running good organizations, maybe there's a gap, they're trying to get from good to great. Most of them have the capacity to do it. They just don't have the right principles. And if you can teach those principles to the team, you can see some really tangible change very quickly.
It sounds like your methodology could benefit organizations even before they have a specific problem, so that they would set themselves up to be more conscious from the get-go. Do you ever do that?
I'd like to say that we get to work with a lot of proactive companies. I'm not going to say it's the vast majority, but we do have the privilege of working with companies who have a sense of where they want to go and want to proactively set out a course for that they really want to create this path for growth. They want to create a path for growth that's inviting to not just the leadership team, but the entire organization. And again, when we're thinking of creating this, as we call it an ecosystem, as you guys call it an organism, this living thing, there is so much more life that's brought into an organization when you can share what it is you're working on. And a lot of that is just having the understanding of where the organization is going. So I would say, yes, a lot of times somebody doesn't come to us and say, I need you to solve employee retention. It's really more of something in my business ecosystem isn't working. Those are our words, not theirs. I'm stuck. My business was growing and then it plateaued and I don't know how to get past this. We're growing, but we should be growing a lot faster. And I don't know really why we're not. I've got a management team and people who I think are holding my business back, but I'm not really sure how to engage them and help them. I just was on LinkedIn and I probably saw 3 different articles on bad managers, people leave managers. I saw one, managers are no longer necessary in the workplace. So I think when you're scaling that business up a little bit, that's another thing we hear. So whether it's proactive or reactive, I think the common thing is that there's this lack of vitality in the business. There's a lack of growth in the business.
Well, and even that terminology strikes me now in this moment, because when you talk about proactive or reactive, it's all centered around a problem versus just being engaged in the moment with the business and taking care of that beehive or taking care of that garden or whatever analogy is the most apt for you. People when you think of a professional gardener, you don't think about them working their entire garden strategy around what problems they anticipate are going to be happening. A
Very
professional
interesting.
garden, being proactive about problems occurring, or reactive. Reactive obviously is worse than being proactive, but really a gardener who's seasoned knows the land. They know how to prepare an ecosystem. They know how to make the land healthy and how to build a garden so that it can thrive. And problems, of course, come up, but you wouldn't say hey, talk to me about your excitement for building this garden. And they say, well, I know how to handle all the problems that I expect to anticipate. That's not the first thing I think that conversation we usually go to. But business, it's striking because this conversation it's touching on a fundamental thing that, we at TrueVille talk about a lot, which is what are the it's the principles versus the tools in a way. And I think you can have tools that teach principles, but generally this entire mindset, this entire generation is, I think, just touching the edges of principles create outcomes and versus control creating outcomes. Like a good foundation, yes. A good environment is going to have problems solve themselves consciously, organically. It's not going to take somebody from a top down or a command and control manner, say, this is how you have to move. This is how this wheel has to turn to make this outcome. It's more cultivating and nourishing the environment and the principles of an organization so that these things happen on their own and they can happen at scale. And I think people are starting to understand it academically, but it's so fundamental. And we see it in so many businesses. And Jonathan, I don't know if you would say the same thing, but it's just so systemic, this idea that somebody has to be driving on a higher position. And I think the biggest shift in the mindset we're talking about here is that people are going to have to let go of the idea that you need to control or prescribe the outcomes, but rather if you focus on that environment, if you focus on the ecosystem and supplementing it, giving it the right energy and the right, I guess, foundational elements, it will thrive. But you may not control the outcomes one to one. I think that's tough for people.
Madelyn, I mean, on some level, if you're shifting a company to principles, do you find that there's receptivity or resistance to the idea that a given company doesn't know business or doesn't know how to run itself? Or it's much easier for companies, I believe, to accept the idea that there's a particular problem with which they might need help, as opposed to you actually need help with how to be, how to exist. So like the company, to take the gardener analogy, I think the companies think they are gardeners, and they are doing, the things that need to be done. But it sounds like, Madelyn, like your objective is almost to teach everyone to be a gardener. Is that right? Or
I'm letting that analogy of a gardener sink in, and I think it's a great one. And then I would say that there's our principle and our understanding of business, and then there is how we try and help business leaders digest that. And those are maybe a little bit different. I would say that for most organizations we work with, when you are walking through this methodology, you do experience an entire shift in mindset. But I don't think you go into it thinking, I need an entire shift in mindset. And I don't think that we would be in business if we went out and tried to tell them you need an entire shift in mindset. Because a shift in mindset that drastic, I don't actually know if that would be good for the organization or for an individual. It's something that is gradual. And one of the things that popped up for me when Sam was talking about this analogy of the gardener is when you think of this master gardener, they know exactly what to do. They know exactly what to work on, and they aren't focused on problems. They aren't being reactive or even really proactive. They're just being, right? They're tending to the garden. And yet so many entrepreneurs are not masters at what they're trying to do. And so they're walking into this, and the most natural thing to gravitate towards is, one, the fires that you have to put out, and two, the things that you feel confident in and know well. And so the business almost ends up being this compilation of, well, we put this in place to solve this problem, and we put this in place because that's where my background is. And that all kind of mushed together as a business. And yet when we think about that and talk through that here, just, without any specific business, we can see why it's so challenging. We can see why it's, well, we're stuck, or people are leaving, or we can't keep clients, because the way we go about creating businesses, and not to say that there's, that we can start a revolution and change that here, but it's not a surprise when we look at how we actually create businesses.
Just a quick note, I think we can create a revolution, everybody. Just to say,
okay.
I just I was going to say that. But so you said something very interesting, that, nobody would be particularly receptive to if the intro was, you're doing everything wrong. So like you come into the doctor, or I'll stop with the analogies. So somebody says that they're having a problem, with an employee or a department, and so how do you transition them? How do you transition them from seeing just that problem that they want you to come into to, really, this is just a symptom. Let me show you something a lot bigger.
I wouldn't say that there's a magic way to do it. It's kind of simply that. We get into the habit as entrepreneurs of solving the problem that's in front of us, and you solve at a surface level, right? And so you end up in this, game of whack-a-mole, essentially. This pops up, I handle it. This pops up, I handle it. Go back to our watchmaker analogy. This is broken, I'm going to fix it. And what that creates is work, but it doesn't create necessarily progress, right? We end up with this kind of compilation of, this is the business we have because we had this problem, we solved it. We had this problem, we solved it in that way. And then that created what our business is today. And so I think that at their core, a business owner does understand and feels that exhaustion of there always being another problem to solve. And so when you can lean into that and really resonate with the fact that, I think you really, Mr. or Miss CEO, understand that like this isn't really the problem, because you've probably tried to solve that and you've probably taken some really great steps to solve that. But what we need to do is step back from this problem solving mentality, and we need to say, well, what is going on in the business? What is lacking in the business right now that is causing this problem? And let's invest there. Let's invest in strengthening, in elevating that piece of our business in a way that the symptom starts going away, because that's really the only way you can, and it's not even a solving of the problem. It's really, you are taking care of the source of the issue. You're establishing that principle, the foundation that Sam was saying, right? It's not, you don't control the outcomes. Work on the principle so that people involved can have what they need to get the outcomes, as individuals that can operate autonomously, but guided and connected in a way.
I just want to highlight one thing you said that always strikes me. You said that they've probably tried solving this problem before. And we see the same exact dynamic where they've tried the same project before, or they've tried revamping a particular operation before, or they've tried these things multiple times without success or degrees of success. And yet they're prepared to keep doing that, and yet it's still hard to shift and say, because it's the way you're problem solving, you're trying to solve this in the wrong way, you need to have a bigger scope. And so it's just interesting that no matter what the results have been in the past, it's still, like you said, a very big jump to get people to think of things in a different, through a different lens.
Yeah, and it's a control thing a lot of the time. People want to feel that they have a target in which they can exert control over, and problems are perfect. I mean, even in this moment, I'm struck by what we're all talking about, transcends problem solving in abstract. Because if you really think about it, I in my career have run into this over and over again, where we're working with clients, you are listening to their surface level problems, and you already know that the root cause problem is deeper, and people are trained to let consultants guide them gently towards a root cause of the problem, which is almost like a nice consulting way of saying your problem is irrelevant, or it's so minor that we don't have to really pay much attention to it. We need to go back further, but we're still calling it the root cause of the problem. So we all have continuity in what we're trying to address. But if we're all being honest, I think in this moment, I could say it's not even really problem solving. It's kind of a red herring in a way, because the problems, the symptoms, the things that generate this energy to get people to look at them, they really are just you're having cracks in the foundation, and they're not a lot of times need to be even related, because the advisement you give is that you need to give more trust, you need to have more autonomy, you need to have more authority in your people. These things that are just generally universal organizational maturity would probably solve 90% of what we see in the field. But there's just such a jump in trying to connect people to it. And that's the challenge, and trying to have them let go of the fact that this fire or this squirrel that you're chasing, it just, from the minute that you said it, it's not the thing. Just let it go. But it's hard. It's hard for people to let it go. It's hard to navigate that conversation, no matter how you look at it.
But this idea of moving to a fire prevention mode from a firefighting mode, it's been around a while, so with all the process improvement methodologies, it was recognized right from the get-go that there was just way too much activity, the whack-a-mole activity, fighting, as opposed to putting in place the things that need to be in place to avoid that scenario. So I guess it still comes back to, and I'm just very interested in, do we think that the way to transform the consciousness, or the most likely way, is that we have to deceive the client almost into thinking that there's some connection to the old problem and then they can move past it, or by subtly giving new principles? Like, what is the best way to raise the consciousness and make that transition? And maybe that's
I was going to say, here's the $1 million question. Yeah, it depends, I think. I think that people, we're talking about, and this is a transaction. If we go back to, we're talking very philosophically almost here, but when we go back to saying, here, I'm an advisor, I can help you, we're talking about a transaction. And for an entrepreneur or a CEO to say, well, I think you can help me, I have to, as that CEO, I have to think there is a problem you can solve. And let me get away from that word problem. There is a pain I am experiencing, right? When we talk about why people buy, it's either this feeling of pain, they're hungry, they need shelter, they're sick, they can't take a vacation, they're exhausted, their marriage is failing because they're always at the office, or it's this idea of kind of that flip side, pleasure, right? Like, I want to have time freedom, I want to buy a new boat, whatever that is. There has to be this incentive to say, well, I think what you have is worth whatever resources I'm going to part with to get that. And so when we're talking about, well, how do you get an entrepreneur to make that shift, you do have to, in some ways, tie it to a pain that they're experiencing. At least I haven't found a way around that. And in fact, I would tell you that the pain, if they are in pain versus them being in the state of pursuing pleasure, the pain is a lot more powerful, and they're a lot more likely to say, I want and need your solution, than someone who says, well, I'd really like my business to be like this. Like, it's okay, it's good, but I'd like it to be like this. There isn't that same level of motivation to try to do something different. But I do think that a lot of entrepreneurs, when we talk to them about, they have this problem they're trying to solve, and start drawing those lines to say, okay, but maybe that's not what you should be, that's not where you should be looking. I do think that sometimes there's almost a sense of relief, because oftentimes they have tried to solve that very unsuccessfully. And when you kind of shift their gaze, I do think that sometimes we get a sense of hope out of them, that it's, oh, so maybe it wasn't that I was necessarily failing at solving this problem, but really I had put my energy, my resources, my focuses on really in the wrong place to get long-term results, right? And so I don't think that that's, in some ways, it's not always well received, but I would say a lot of times it's met with oh, I guess we hadn't tried that before.
Well, I think those moments, that anecdote you're just sharing, is the moments in micro and one-to-one transactions where consciousness is being raised, where a new way is being contemplated, and they have an openness to consider the problem or consider their own trust in consultants or in outside help that they could actually impact their business positively. But it really struck me in what you were describing. It's funny because you're describing stuff that I feel like Jonathan and I have also experienced, being in the same domain, but it's funny how hearing somebody else say it through their experience, it kind of, you're a third party and you can kind of say, oh, geez, I'm seeing something new already. But it's this interesting, we have a lot of gripes sometimes about the consulting industry because there's that bifurcation there of what you just said. And there's almost a bad incentive structure because they have a problem and the consultant gets paid to solve it, not to push back on them and to teach them something new or try to elevate their consciousness or show them something they're not seeing. So get this dynamic that we're talking about where I've got a problem. And as a consultant, I have to decide in that moment almost, do I continue to service you the way you want to be serviced so that this relationship can work economically? Or do I really go with what a lot of consultants I think are starting to figure out in the field for different reasons as business just continues to evolve, that the old way of doing things and the old way of problem solving and the old way of tackling business challenges is not there. But consultants have to make that choice on a conversation by conversation basis. Do I really try to shift into what I know will probably work, or do I just concede and just work with the owner on what they want to pay for? And I think that a lot of consultants are pressured, especially in bigger firms, to just throw it in, and in a way, it's a disingenuous transaction. I don't think it's helping elevate consciousness across the industry at large. But there's so much economic pressure. I mean, how else can they survive if every other client they say, this is not the problem. This is not the conversation we want to have with you. And if you're not willing to meet us in a place where we can all be more conscious about it, then I don't think there's a good opportunity here. That's a really tough thing for a consultant to absorb. And I don't blame them. But again, there's this unhealthy dynamic. So we're touching on, I always feel like we're shifting topic a little bit, but your answer to the last question really prompts this whole unhealthy relationship that's going on a lot of places with consulting and business, and everyone's trying to figure it out, but it's tough.
Well, it also gets to the issue of beyond maybe the disincentive in how they're going about solving that problem. The other one is in teaching or providing the entity, or in order to raise their consciousness, they need to give their methodology. So they would need to give the entity the tools with which to do it, solve these problems or avoid these problems in the future, which is even a higher level of disincentive for consultants, because then there's not going to be, it'd be like a doctor making people completely healthy for the future. There'll never be a need for the doctor. So I think that this really goes to, and, Madelyn, I know that you're, I was going to say an educator, but also maybe more of an empowerer. Do you, in your methodology, if the company is receptive to it, how much of your methodology are you actually conveying to them?
All of it. And wow, what an interesting, thank you for going in this direction, Sam, because when I was talking about it, that wasn't the direction I was necessarily heading, but it's such an important and real one, because we are almost, as consultants, as an industry, and we'll just talk super generally, and hopefully we won't offend anyone too much. We are perpetuating the solve a problem mentality. Find the problem, solve it. And because we go out there and we say, we solve this problem, we do this. Oh, you have that problem, I can fix it. And so to get back really to what John's question was, we believe in a configurable, or our methodology is configurable, because we don't think that necessarily in most businesses you need to replace everything. We believe that a lot of businesses have some great things in them. And so it's really about identifying what in this business really needs help right now. And maybe that changes as the organization grows. But and this is maybe getting too tangible, but all of our programs are a fixed length in time. All of our programs seek to walk an organization, usually their leadership team, maybe their management team, through the concepts and infuse that knowledge into the organization, so that when we leave, they are a stronger organization. And I think that ties back to the why. And when you think about it, in some ways we're trying to heal organizations in a way they never need to call us again, right? But there are so many businesses out there that need help that I guess it was never a second thought that we would run out of business. And if we did, then we've changed the world. So, it's like, I guess there's no lose situation here. Because that is really how you change a business. That is really how you go in as a consultant or an advisor of any sort. If you are the catalyst to the change, if you are the front runner, the driver, and without you, that change leaves the organization, you haven't done your job. You haven't serviced that client or that business in any way. You have plugged yourself in, you've been an employee. You've gotten paid for your work. And when you leave, everything leaves with you. And that's not what we're called to do. I mean, people don't hang out their shingle and say, I'm going to be a consultant because I want to get paid to just do strategy. Like they hang out their shingle because they are passionate about business leaders. They're passionate about what businesses do for individuals, whether that's monetarily, being able to support their families and themselves, or being able to grow in skills and contribute to their communities. And so if we go out there and we say we help businesses, and yet we do not leave them, not just with, here's my book of a report for you to read, but if we do not leave them more capable than we found them, then we are absolutely doing a disservice to them and to the industry, and people's willingness overall to trust that consultants can bring them long-lasting change.
You probably did offend some. Yeah, but I think that was somewhat aspirational. I don't know that you described the entire industry exactly.
Well, she's describing what we're talking about, which is capability building should be, at a base, the mantra for consultants. And if they're not there, I mean, it's the work I was referring to. I mean, if you feel incentivized to upsell or create more problems or create a dependency, it's against the consulting in principle, but I think it's gotten so muddy over the years of that industry. Like a lot of things, if you let the industry become self-perpetuating and self-propagating, it grows in a way that benefits the people that are in it, which again is not attributing blame. I think that's a natural thing for any business model that starts to want to fortify itself and to grow and to get more business. But it's certainly it's the paradox of consulting, which is if you're automating, if you're improving, you should be slowly putting yourself out of work. Just like the same thing, if your job was to do that internally for a company, you should always be at risk of putting yourself out of a job if you're the one who's supposed to be improving things and kind of solving the environment and solving. So it's a tough thing. And I think Madelyn, you articulated it beautifully. And I think consultants, it's not just the businesses. We started the conversation with businesses, they need to go through a mindset change. The consultants are the other side of that. People who come in and say, I can solve your problems. They're part of that conversation too. And we all need to get together. People are going to see things differently, and we're going to elevate the way we think about business, the way we think about organizations. It has to be cooperative. You can't say that I'm the person who's going to solve your problem, even though I don't really believe these problems should have existed in the first place. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of stuff there that needs to be fixed in that conversation on both sides.
And that's the key. I think it's both sides, because even if we did live in that aspirational world where every consultant was led by Madelyn's principles here, I think that we would still find that there's a lot of resistance, as we talked about already. If you come in and say, hey, I could elevate your entire consciousness, I could help you avoid problems like these in the future, you're still going to get, no, I really just want you to solve this problem to some degree, so in that, when we said, it's $1 million question, how do you get an organization to have their consciousness raised? Well, that's the tension on why maybe some of the consulting industry exists the way it does and the way we wish it didn't. So, I mean, it's also a element of the patient still smoking and the doctor saying, but I could show you how you could feel better or why this is going to cause more pain, and yet they keep going. So it's there is that dynamic.
Well, that's what I was just going to add on to your comment. It's everything. It's the entire culture, is our entire mindset of this time period. And I'll just say Western culture because it's what we happen to be in. But this mentality of you feel tension, you feel pain, and you go to the doctor. And if the doctor has two options, one says that you can just take this pill and feel better, or you need to go back and you need to invest in spiritual work and you need to invest in wholeness and making your body whole, and like put the work back on them and say, you are the root cause of your own distress and your own problems. people will turn and they'll grab the pill and say, thank you. I'll try this first, and then I'll come back and maybe I'll work on that other stuff you were talking about. And that's the culture that's become normalized. And again, I don't say that disparagingly to any particular entity or group of people, but I think we can all relate to that to some extent, that that's the mentality. And it's the same thing. That mentality carries from your personal life to your professional life, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a business. And if we're going to go more towards what the ReWild Group is saying, what Truval is saying in terms of, principled conscious foundations, which creates environments for success, that mentality is going to have to shift because it's kind of diametrically opposed in a lot of ways.
Madelyn, have you followed up with entities or seen how their consciousness has shifted? The ones that successfully went through various problem solving or the process.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have said problem solving. We already.
I do get the pleasure of kind of getting a glimpse into that, and I do have to say before I jump into that, Jon, I appreciate that you're going to call me out if it's too aspirational, and I like that. I think it's also when I think about leaving an organization better, though, I think it can be in micro ways too. And that's part of it, is that there's some organizations that our network of advisors, the people who subscribe to our methodology and use it, whether they're a business owner or a consultant, it's about making incremental changes. And I think if I go back to that $1 million question of like, how do you do it? It's kind of one step at a time. It is one business making incremental changes, showing up in that in their sphere of influence as stronger, more successful, more resilient. We talk about the idea that a lot of times structure or principles, these foundations, they're not intended to give a rigidity. They should be created in a way that gives resilience, right? That it has this it can withstand pressure. It can withstand changes. It can withstand time. It doesn't.
Otherwise, it would be
break.
just
it's
replacing what they have now with another replacement.
Right. Exactly. And it is challenging because what we are trying to do is say, okay, this is what you're experiencing, and we're going to infuse something that's going to change that for your organization. And a lot of people say, okay, well, what's the ROI on that? Yeah, that's a real good question. What is the ROI between an organization that can withstand going through something like COVID and what can't? I mean, it's a lot, but it's more than money for sure. But that is how that's how we buy. It's how we prospect things. So let me go back to the earlier question of what are some examples? So let me just think of some stories. Let me talk about one entrepreneur who he had started out and he's a tech consulting and had some partners, and they were struggling. And what was coming up was things like not enough cash flow, and they weren't trying to acquire clients was really challenging. Well, we did work on their values. When we talk about values, we talk about two sets. We talk about brand values, and that's really the promise we make to our clients and our market. And then our core values, which is the promise we make to our team and each other. They're two different people, two different sets of people. They care about two different things. And going through that work, what became very clear is that the partners, the reason that they were having trouble with cash flow and the reason they were having trouble acquiring new customers is because they did not share values. And so they decided to part ways. And a year later, the CEO is very successful building his team. But he would describe it as he just had clarity on who he was and how he was trying to show up. And that led to being able to invite people into that. That is not the problem he thought he needed to solve. I mean, it wasn't even in his purview, right? He was but first-time entrepreneur, and it was like, okay, these guys have connections. We should join forces and let's go out to the market. And I know that there's a million other stories just like that one, that it's like, well, there was something foundational, fundamental, principle-based, the crack in the foundation that would have always persisted, no matter if you got a new marketing company, right? Because we're not acquiring new clients. Oh, we need to redo the website. We need to be better on social. And those are all these things that it's like we're trying to solve that thing that we see as the problem when it's not. We can spend a lot of money there.
Yeah, we've talked about this on the podcast before. If you don't know your purpose, why you exist, essentially, which sounds, very esoteric or, not really relevant to a particular problem in consulting, but it's foundational. And like you said, it permeates every other thing that you do. And that's the number one problem. It makes perfect sense that would be the number one reason why there wouldn't have been alignment between founding partners, because if they disagree on their why, they're not going to get very far as a group or as a single conscious organism.
Yeah, and it's a great anecdote because it's the same things that we talk about a lot on, like Jonathan said on our podcast, self-awareness, honesty. If you're a rabbit and your business strategy is you're forcing yourself to eat meat every day, and you come to me and you're a little bunny and you got blood all over your face and you're like, I feel sick. This isn't working. How do I change my strategy? It's like you are a rabbit. You are not a carnivore. You need to eat lettuce to be well. And it's just this immediate, oh my God, I didn't even think about it like that. The lack of self-awareness, that lack of connectivity between what they think they need to do and what they want to get done and the means in which to do it versus who they are, what they want to be doing, what they want to get done. Some people skip over that. So many people skip over that. Entrepreneurs are just as guilty as everyone else. Get up every day. Don't ask yourself, what do I want to do today? What do I feel like I should be doing today? But planning what I am going to do regardless. And it seems subtle, but it's an extremely important disconnect.
It's huge. It makes me think of, we have this concept of the thinking doing sequence. And it's the idea that critical thinking gives way to focusing and should inform planning and then inform doing. And yet the vast majority of us sit right over here, plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, and we get stuck. And we actually never even really think why we're doing this. Is this in alignment with where we're trying to go, achieve as an organization, as a person? Or we think, well, we'll do this once, and then we just put our heads down. And I'll be the first one to say it. Coming up with your why as a human or as a business is hard. And you might not get it right the first time. And so when people are like, we have to really get down to your why, and it's like this is something I can just check off, and it's not. I think that the idea of honesty, right? That this is a hard thing that a lot of us go into business as individuals, still on this journey, and maybe very early on, or maybe not on it at all, of who we are as people, and having this, self-awareness journey that we should all be on. And quite frankly, a lot of us don't have the time, energy, or focus on that. And then we're going to create a business that is also an entity, and we're going to try to guide that business into who they are, who it's supposed to be, and invite other people, all with their own unique personalities, their own whys, into this organization. And so even though, and this is I think is a critical thing, your why, your values, those are so critical. They're so important, and yet they are not easy. And it is something that you may have to work at for a long time, but it is that recognition of the importance, that it is maybe a work in progress, that you can recognize when you are a rabbit having to eat meat every day and being able to align. And that's where the principles, like when we talk about, we teach principles, we believe in principles, instilling principles in organizations. That's why it's so important, is because if you understand, well, here's this core foundation, right? That my business is an entity. It's a living thing. And if it's something is off in that, I understand that at a principle level, I can make the adjustments that are needed because I have the information. I have that skill. I've flexed that muscle in some sort of way. And that's really the goal. I mean, it's not the goal, as we've discussed, we don't have to go into that of every consultant, but that 100% is what our methodology is we need to go out there and share this information with businesses, all of them, every single one, if I had it my way, right? Because with that, they can have more successful organizations, whether they ever call me or know anyone on our team.
We cover a lot mindfulness on the podcast and see it as one, and don't really see the distinction between how someone is at work or how someone is personally, or anything like that, because mindfulness or consciousness, it's always the case. It's always relevant, and you're always you wherever you go. So you don't really become two different people, of course. But I think that it does get into the challenge that people have with mindfulness. So there are a lot of people who don't want to be conscious, at a given time, because they, like you said, that is a hard process to do. But to the extent the individual can do it, and that's the same extent that the business can do it as a whole. I want to just make sure we covered one thing. You said something very interesting before about making the changes, micro changes, in stages. And we've covered a lot the transition state of projects and on this podcast, and the delta between the as is and the to be, which is essentially what we're talking about. We're saying you're, let's say, completely unconscious, or, all the way to being very conscious. And that delta has a cost, and that is its own, that's its own effort, even distinct from whatever else is going on in all the operations. How do you navigate that? So you see everything the entity could be if they were fully in your, fully following your methodology, and there's a particular pain point that they're looking at, and how do you modulate what information you're giving them, so that it's not like all at one time, oh my God, I got to change my diet, I got to change my, change everything about myself as a business.
Yeah, it makes me think of the idea of habit stacking. I have a coach and he was just talking about that idea of habit stacking, right? To change one thing, get that under control, add something else to it. Because a lot of times we have this, let me take the pill mentality, I'm going to change all these things. We do it in just the word you use is perfect, in a modular way. When we talk about this is an element we want to work on, it's essentially a series of learn and application cycle, I guess, is a really good way to think of it. So we'll take this concept, we need to work on, I'll stick with my earlier example, the brand and core values, building block of your organization, element in your organization. And we start learning, well, what are brand values? Why are they important? What are examples? How do you create them? And then you walk through an exercise, an application of that. Well, what does that look like for the business? And before you start, changing everything on the website and it's informing everything else, you sit with it, right? You live with it, you apply it, you start having conversations, you test it out, put it through the stress test a little bit, and then you build on that. So we just did that with brand values. Okay, now let's look at core values. So what does that look like? What are they? How do you create them? What are examples? Why are they important? What should they inform? And now look at our business. What is that for our business? And live with them, right? See how that works. And then it's, okay, now we've got two, are they in alignment? And at each step of the way, you're making these realizations. You're realizing that your first cut at it wasn't perfect and you're adjusting. But then here's what's really the most important. I remember I was just having a conversation the other day with one of our advisors in New York. And what he said is, he was walking through this with a business. And he was working on their business model, actually. And he said he saw where they could be. And he kind of had this, he knew that end state that they should be pushing towards, but it was very different from where they are today. And what they ended up with was a step in that direction. And he said, I had to decide between pushing them all the way there and risking that we would lose the step they made, or knowing that what I have taught them is how to step in that direction. And the next time we go through it, the next time we have the conversation, that they'll work themselves to that state. And I thought it was a perfect illustration, because what we are teaching is the principle. And the first time through, you're probably not going to get it perfect. But if you understand how to do it, if you understand why you're doing it, and you have a starting point, that's the goal. That's mission achieved, right? And now, practically, what does that look like? Does it mean you never touch that again? Does it mean the advisor never comes in and you never have a session on it again? No, probably not. Probably not. You have people change and turnover, you grow, but that's what it should look like. That's what it looks like for us. And it's one piece, one concept at a time through the organization. And a lot of times, if you think about, we're talking concepts here, you're doing that with a team, probably the leadership team. Well, then there's the work to take that and flow it through the organization, which needs to be done effectively, efficiently, and one step at a time as well.
You said something that I've seen in, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So you've seen that is this step before actually doing, I gave you information and then, run through all these steps. That step of awareness, if you could change that perspective just a little bit, the power of that is much more likely to take and have positive impact than if you, in the example you gave, if you tried pushing them through all that change all the way to the end. No matter how amazing that end state is, it's just not how humans work. Humans need to be able to pause first and just be observers, aware of of the impact that they're having. So if there is no why, they just need to sit with even that concept. They need to see in a practical way, how is that not how is that manifesting or not allowing us to manifest? And that is very, very powerful on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other dynamic, and I don't necessarily know how this fits in, but I feel like it's worth saying. We're bringing all these individuals together and we're trying to ask them to further an organization in some sort of way. And while the various perspectives and experiences and talents and skills are all valuable, it also creates almost this dynamic where we're not all necessarily speaking the same language. I mean, we may actually be all speaking the same language, but in ways we're not. And so when we start out by saying, let's lay a foundation, here are the principles. It doesn't matter if you have your doctorate degree. It doesn't matter if you've been in business for 50 years. All these things, everyone gets a set of tools. Everyone gets a marker for the whiteboard. And we're all working together. And because we're all speaking the same language now, we have this shared principle. What we can achieve in that context with those tools, not actual tools, but figurative tools, it's extraordinary. It is extraordinary what we can do, because that is how it's like the connectors. You make the connections and they're able to do the work on their business. And the role of the advisor, we use the word advisor, that's what we call them. They're a facilitator. They are really if they're really doing their job right, if they've really empowered, and it doesn't mean they stand back. They're trying to guide and nudge, but they're asking the questions. They're prodding, they're poking. They're trying to make sure that what they leave that organization with, that the organization feels strong in. It really doesn't matter how the advisor feels about it. I mean, they need to be present and make sure they're not, malpracticing here. But the point is that team has to feel strong about it. That's the work that they're supposed to be doing.
Well said. Yeah, it's funny how you see, it's very encouraging, starting to get to some closing thoughts on my part, to see other people, seeing your own language, hearing the way that your group has been pioneering into this type of work, because it really is, when you talk about building an environment, and you talk about sustaining an organism, it's all about connectivity. It's all about transparency, the flow of data, the things that make the organism itself more alive, more sentient, more connected, more reactive. Like they can read when they're connected, they can read the environment better than in everyone, a Tower of Babel situation where everyone doesn't have a common language, they don't have a common ground, nothing can be built, nothing can be progressed. And there's no amount of forcing energy into that scenario that's going to produce results out of a fragmented environment where there's no connectivity. So it's fascinating and encouraging to hear the way you're articulating it. I think from my perspective, there's so many exciting topics. We could talk for hours just on some of the things at a high level, but I really do think thematically, we're at a really cool time in history where the clock is becoming the beehive, from your example, or it's becoming Yellowstone, where it's not that it was a clock that's now transforming from inanimate to animate. The reality was we've all been forcing a living thing to behave like a clock. And it's like releasing those living things from their bondage, from their slavery, in a way that you don't have to conform to this very mechanical view of your life, of your role. You can be alive, you can come alive and inhabit your body and think for yourself and do things. And it's a very liberating way to look at business, and in my opinion, a very liberating way to look at consulting, which is, you're releasing energy from its bondage, from this reductionist command and control, top-down way of doing business that's been prevailing for the last several decades. And so it's a really exciting time, but it's a very challenging time. And I think people are going to have to ask themselves, and you hear this conversation we've had with you today, Madelyn, and what we talk about a lot, which is, do you want to take the easy pill from an external provider, or do you want to create space? Do you want to self-reflect and have awareness of what you are and what you want and what you could be, what you could actualize to? Because that energy from an owner perspective is what feeds into your business of any size or scale. And people have to be aware of what kind of nourishment energetically they're giving to their businesses and these ecosystems. Because if you're trying to take sort of bad, negative, like awareness, like people who are lacking awareness, and they put all this bad energy into the business is not going to grow. The garden's not going to grow. So I know I'm just kind of word vomiting up a lot of really, lofty things now, but it's such an exciting group of topics. I'm effusive about the way that I'm hoping everything is going, basically. So I'll close my thoughts there.
Madelyn, what are some final thoughts that you have, or a summation?
Yeah, I would agree. I want to just thank both of you, not just for your time here today, but what you're doing. I spend a lot of time just talking to others in the space, a lot of consultants, and I'll oftentimes come across someone who says, well, we do the same thing. Why would you want to talk to me? We're kind of competitors. And I always say, well, I believe in helping businesses. I believe when we help businesses, we help people. And when we help people, we help the world. And if I can help you, I don't know. I mean, of course I should be talking to you. If you're doing something great that I can learn from, or I'm doing something great you can learn from, why aren't we talking?
You just gave a real world example of, we know our why, and you have the same why. So already there's alignment. And this a historical way of thinking about how we should be interacting is not part of being a conscious entity.
It's not. So I think that it just in closing, there is so much opportunity, and I may be the kind of the glass half full kind of person always. But the reason I got into this, the reason I sit here and it's my name and the ReWild Group is under it here today, is I was in a business that did this. And it is hard for me, although I find a way when people say, well, what's the ROI? Because what I can tell you is how it felt as an individual, as a person within that organization, and what it did for me as a person. What I watched, it changed people's lives. It changed their level of confidence, their level of capability. It changed how they felt about themselves, and it changed how they then showed up in every other area of their lives. And so for anyone who is out there who is trying to be the consultant or be the business owner, I just appreciate every single person that's on this journey, because it's us, it's all of us making those micro steps forward that is going to make a difference. And Sam's right. He's got me on his camp. I shouldn't have said we can't start a revolution, because here we are. It is in these small steps. I'm signing up. I'm connecting with Sam, and I'll be signing whatever that petition is. But what was that, Sam?
You're the first on our 320 million US petition.
Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, I just want to thank you. It is wonderful to connect with other people on this mission and be able to support each other and collaborate, because there is an energy and a vitality in connecting with other people. And that's the same vitality, the same energy we're trying to bring to organizations, one little micro step at a time.
Thank you, Madelyn.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Talk next week.